By the second week of August, the rice fields of Cypress County had turned the color of old rope. From the highway, they looked burned. Brown stalks leaned over black water. Leaves hung shredded from their stems. Beetle shells floated in the irrigation ditches by the thousands, gathering against fence posts and culvert pipes like coffee grounds after a storm. Men who had farmed that valley for 40 years stood along the road without speaking. Silas Boone was one of them. He owned more rice ground than anyone within 20 miles, and 6 weeks earlier he had laughed so hard at Martha Hale that he had to wipe tears from his eyes. Now he stood in mud up to his boot heels, crushing a dead rice head between his fingers. Across the drainage ditch, Martha's field was still green, not perfect. There were brown patches along the southern edge, places where the beetles had gotten in before she understood what she was fighting. But the center of the field stood shoulder high and alive, bending under grain, and moving between the rows were all 18 ducks. They disappeared beneath the rice canopy, then reappeared farther down, tails in the air, bills working through the shallow water, as if the destruction surrounding them had nothing to do with them. Martha stood beside a wooden gate with one hand pressed against the small of her back. She was 8 months pregnant now. The cotton dress beneath her work apron stretched tight across her belly, and sweat darkened the hair at her temples. She watched Silas cross the ditch. Behind him came 3 neighboring farmers and Dr. Edwin Mercer from the county office. No one laughed. Silas stopped at the fence. For several seconds he stared at the ducks, then at Martha's rice, then back toward his own field, where an entire season's work had gone brown in less than 10 days. "How many of those birds do you have left?" he asked. 18. "I'll buy them." Martha said nothing. "I mean it," Silas continued. "Name your price." 6 weeks earlier, he had called those same ducks 18 useless mouths. Now his voice had changed. Martha rested her hand on the gate. "You still think it's the ducks?" Silas frowned. Before he could answer, one white feather drifted between them and landed on the muddy water. 6 weeks earlier, Martha Hale had spent nearly her last dollar buying those 18 ducks, and everyone at the market had laughed. The strangest part was this: Martha hadn't bought them to save her rice. 6 weeks earlier, Martha Hale had $37.80 to her name. She knew the exact amount because she had counted it 3 times that morning at the kitchen table. $37.80 for feed, kerosene, medicine, seed, and whatever the baby might need before harvest. Outside the window, 20 acres of rice shimmered beneath the July heat. People in Cypress County still called it Elias Hale's farm. Elias had been dead 7 months. A wagon accident had taken him before winter broke, leaving Martha with a mortgage, a field half prepared for planting, and a child growing beneath her heart. Neighbors had offered advice. Most of it sounded kind. "You could sell before things get worse. There's no shame in going back to your sister. Farming was Elias's life, Martha. You don't have to make it yours." They thought they were giving her permission to quit. What Martha heard was something different. You were his wife, he was the farmer. Now he is gone. By the time Martha reached the Saturday market, most of the $37 was already spoken for. A small sack of feed, lamp oil, salt, the iron tonic Ruth insisted she keep taking, a payment at the general store that could not be delayed another week. When Martha finished, she stood beside the wagon and counted what remained. $12.80. That was all. Then she heard the commotion beside the livestock pens. A farmer from upriver was trying to sell a crate of young ducks, 18 of them. Thin, noisy, muddy-footed things, too old to be pretty ducklings and too small to interest anyone looking for meat. "Take the lot," the man said. "I'm tired of feeding them." Martha almost walked past. Then one duck snapped at a grasshopper near the water trough. Another chased a beetle beneath a wagon wheel. 3 more pushed their bills through wet straw, searching for something alive. Martha stopped. She watched them for nearly 5 minutes. The seller noticed. "How much do you have?" Martha hesitated. $12.80. He looked at the birds. then at the battered crate. Birds and crate. Martha stared at him. All 18? All 18. Her fingers closed around the money inside her glove. $12.80. Every cent she had left. She should have kept walking. Instead, she asked, "Do they forage?" The man laughed. "Lady, they'll eat anything slower than they are." Martha looked at the ducks again. Then she placed every coin and folded bill into his hand. By the time Silas Boone came around the corner, she was tying the crate into the back of her wagon. He stared at the birds, then at Martha. "You bought those?" A few men nearby turned. They were cheap. Silas smiled, not cruelly at first, more like a man watching a child misunderstand arithmetic. "Your husband bought seed," he said. "You bought mouths." Someone laughed, then another. Martha tightened the rope. Silas glanced toward her stomach. "You've already got one mouth coming you can't afford." The laughter stopped for half a second. Martha pulled the knot tighter until the rope bit into her palm. A white feather floated from the crate and caught against her sleeve. She brushed it once. It stayed. Silas shook his head. Elias knew farming was numbers. Martha climbed onto the wagon seat. She did not answer. There was nothing left in her glove now. Not a bill, not a coin. She drove home with 18 ducks, an empty pocket, and Silas Boone's words following her down the road. By sunset, she would learn the first thing the men at the market had gotten right. The ducks were hungry. By sunrise the next morning, Martha understood exactly what Silas Boone had meant about mouths. The ducks ate like they had been starved for a month. They stripped weeds beside the shed, chased grasshoppers through the yard, pecked spilled grain from beneath the wagon, and followed Martha so closely that twice she nearly stepped on them. Feed would not last. She stood beside the barn with one hand pressed against her belly and watched 18 bills work through the dirt. Then she looked toward the rice. The field held shallow water between the rows. Insects hovered above it. Small things moved along the stems. Martha opened the gate. At first, the ducks seemed to know exactly what to do. They rushed into the water. They snapped at flies. They plunged their heads beneath the surface. For 10 glorious minutes, Martha thought she had been clever. Then the flock reached the younger rice. One bird pushed straight through a row. Another followed. Within seconds, muddy water churned around their feet. Tender stalks bent. Several disappeared beneath the surface entirely. "No! No! No!" Martha waded after them. The ducks scattered. The harder she tried to push them away from the seedlings, the wider they spread. By the time she drove them back through the gate, her dress was soaked to the knees and a patch of young rice lay flattened in the mud. Martha stood staring at it. A truck engine coughed behind her. Dr. Edwin Mercer stepped down from a county pickup carrying a leather field case. He was a narrow man in his 50s who spoke carefully, as though every sentence ought to survive being printed in a government bulletin. He looked at the damaged patch, then at the ducks, then at Martha. "I heard you bought livestock. News travels fast. In Cypress County, bad news travels faster." He crouched beside the rice. "Ducks will forage. They'll eat insects. They'll also trample young plants if they're concentrated badly." Martha folded her arms. "So they can help." "I said they can eat insects." Mercer stood. "That is not the same thing as saying they can protect 20 acres. He pointed toward the flattened stalks. "You have to control where they go, when they enter, how long they stay. Otherwise you may create a second problem while trying to solve the first." Martha hated that he sounded reasonable. That afternoon, Ruth Avery came by with a jar of preserved peaches and found Martha repairing the gate. "You've been out here all day?" "I'm fine." Ruth glanced at Martha's swollen ankles. "You don't have to prove you can hurt yourself better than a man." Martha stopped tying the wire. "I'm not proving anything." Ruth said nothing. That was worse. Near dusk, Martha shut the ducks inside their pen. For the first time since leaving the market, she let herself think it. Maybe Silas had been right. Maybe she had spent $12 she needed on 18 animals she could not afford. She turned to latch the final gate. Then something in the rice caught her eye. A narrow strip beside the water channel. The ducks had spent most of the morning there. The plants were muddy. A few were bent, but the leaves looked different. Martha stepped closer. On the rows beside them, insects had chewed tiny crescents from the green edges. On the strip the ducks had crossed, almost none. Martha stood very still. Then she opened the gate again. The next morning, Martha did something she had never seen Elias do. She divided the field, not with survey flags or proper fencing. She had neither. She used old feed sacks tied to stakes, 2 lengths of sagging wire, and a gate made from a section of broken hog panel. One patch of rice would get the ducks. The other would not. If the birds were helping, she wanted proof. If they were ruining the field, she wanted that proof too. For 3 days, Martha watched. She carried a notebook in the pocket of her apron and made marks every time she saw something worth remembering. 6 ducks feeding near the west ditch. Heavy insect damage along the untreated row. 2 flattened seedlings near the gate. Almost no chewing on the leaves where the flock had spent the morning. Nothing she wrote looked important by itself. That bothered her. She had been hoping for something obvious. A miracle, perhaps. Instead, farming gave her differences so small they could disappear if she blinked. On the 4th morning, Martha crouched between 2 rows and found a white feather caught against a rice stem. She recognized it immediately, the same kind that had clung to her sleeve at the market. She almost smiled. Then she noticed the leaf behind it. Clean. The leaf beside it was clean too. 3 rows farther over, outside the duck section, the edges were ragged with small half-moon bites. Martha moved slowly through the plants. She stopped counting damaged leaves after 50. Then she went back through the section the ducks had worked. 9. She sat down in the mud. For the first time since buying the birds, she felt something stronger than hope. Curiosity. The ducks were not wandering. They were searching. She began following them instead of driving them. That changed everything. They ignored most of the rice itself. Their bills worked along the waterline, beneath leaves, around stems, inside clumps of floating weeds. One duck snapped at a small brown insect and swallowed it. Another found something under the water and shook it hard before gulping it down. Martha moved closer. The next insect she caught herself. Brown-backed, hard-shelled, no bigger than her thumbnail. It clung to the underside of a rice leaf. She dropped it into an empty jelly jar. By noon, there were 7 inside. By evening, 12. The following morning, Martha walked the untreated patch before breakfast. She found 17 more. Some were alone. Others had gathered where the rice was thickest. She carried the jar to the porch and set it beside her notebook. The ducks crowded at the fence below, complaining loudly. Martha looked from them to the insects, then back toward the field. Maybe the birds were not simply eating whatever they happened to find. Maybe they had been hunting the very thing chewing through her crop. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it frightened her. Because when Martha returned to the field that afternoon, she found more beetles than she had found that morning. And by sundown, she had stopped counting at 30. Martha carried the beetles to the county office in a jelly jar. By the time she reached town, the insects had climbed halfway up the glass and were tapping against the lid. Dr. Mercer held the jar beneath the window. For once, he did not lecture. He turned it slowly in his hand. Then he looked at Martha. "How many did you find?" 30 yesterday. And today? I stopped counting. That answer changed his face. Mercer set the jar down and opened a drawer filled with field reports. 2 farms north of you called yesterday. Boone's foreman came in this morning. Martha felt her stomach tighten. So it's not just mine. No. He pulled out a map. Small pencil marks had been made across 3 sections of the county. Pest pressure is building. Martha reached into her bag and placed her notebook on his desk. I've been watching where the ducks feed. Mercer opened it. Pages of crooked numbers, damaged leaves, feeding times, water depth. Places the ducks gathered, places they avoided. He read longer than Martha expected. Finally, he tapped one column with his finger. You may be seeing an effect. Martha waited. But don't hear more than I'm saying. Her hope cooled. Ducks eat insects. That part isn't remarkable. They're eating these. Some of them. They're helping. Possibly. Martha leaned forward. Mercer closed the notebook. 18 ducks eating insects in a controlled patch is one thing. 18 ducks suppressing a serious outbreak across 20 acres is another. So what am I supposed to do? If the numbers rise, you'll need a plan bigger than the birds. Martha almost laughed. A bigger plan usually meant money. Money was the one thing she did not have. When she returned home, Silas Boone was standing beside his truck near the South Road. Two men were unloading drums into one of his sheds. He nodded toward Martha's jar. Mercer, confirm your little bug problem? County problem. Silas looked across her field. And you're still trusting the ducks? I'm watching them. That isn't what I asked. Martha started past him. Silas spoke again. You know what I think? No. I think Elias would have bought protection before things got bad. Martha stopped. There it was again. Elias. Always Elias. Silas glanced at her belly. You've got more to lose than a crop now. Martha turned. His voice was quieter this time. Almost reasonable. That baby needs a house more than you need to prove a point. For a second, Martha had no answer, because that was the sentence she had been trying not to say to herself. Silas climbed into his truck. You're betting a child's home on barnyard birds. He drove away. That evening, Martha walked the western rows until the light failed. The ducks worked ahead of her, bills dipping and flashing. For a while, the rice looked healthy. Then she reached the boundary fence. Across it lay Silas Boone's first field. Martha pulled one leaf toward her. 3 beetles clung beneath it, then another leaf. 5. Farther down the row, the plants seemed to move. Not from wind, from insects. Martha stood at the fence as the last sunlight disappeared. The outbreak had begun. By Monday morning, the first brown line had appeared. It began at the north end of Silas Boone's property, no wider than a wagon road. From a distance, it looked like drought. Up close, the leaves told the truth. Their edges had been eaten ragged. Some plants were stripped almost to the stem. Beetles clung beneath the remaining blades in clusters, dropping into the water whenever a shadow passed over them. By Tuesday, the brown line had widened. By Wednesday, it had crossed 2 farms. Men drove trucks along the levees carrying drums, hand pumps, sacks, anything they thought might slow it. Martha watched from her own field. The beetles had reached her too, but something was wrong with the pattern. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The eastern rows showed almost no damage. The southwest corner showed much more. Along the narrow ditch where the ducks spent every afternoon, the rice remained thick and clean. 50 yards away, where the water stood deeper and the ducks rarely wandered, leaves were chewed almost overnight. Martha stopped looking at beetles. She started looking at ducks. For 2 days, she followed them with her notebook. They preferred the shallower water. They moved quickly through open spaces. They avoided dense patches where fallen stalks tangled beneath the surface. They returned to the same feeding places again and again, and entire sections of the field were almost never visited. Martha drew a rough square on a page, then another. She marked the places where she found the worst damage. Next, she marked the places where the ducks spent the most time. When she finished, she stared at the page. The marks barely touched. The beetles were strongest where the ducks were weakest. A voice behind her said, "You've been standing in the sun too long." Ruth Avery was carrying a basket covered with a dish towel. "I brought supper. I'm not hungry." That wasn't the question. Martha kept drawing. Ruth set the basket on the porch rail and watched her. "You sleep last night?" "Some," meaning no. Martha rubbed the ache at the base of her back. Ruth lowered her voice. "You can come stay with me until this settles." Martha looked up sharply. "I'm not leaving. I didn't say leave the farm. You meant it. I meant you're 7 months pregnant and walking 20 acres in August heat." Martha closed the notebook. "So now you think I can't handle it too?" Ruth's expression changed. "No, Martha." She stepped closer. "I think you're so busy proving nobody has to carry you that you've forgotten carrying is what people do for each other." Martha looked away. For once, Ruth did not press. She simply uncovered the basket, left 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, and walked back down the road. That evening, Martha ate both of them standing over the kitchen table. Then she spread her notebook open, beside a kerosene lamp. She drew the field again, this time larger. Shallow water, deep water, open lanes, dense rice, duck roots, beetle damage. She connected the marks with a pencil until the paper looked like a battle map. The answer was sitting there. She had been asking the wrong question. It was not whether 18 ducks could eat enough beetles. It was whether 18 ducks could be made to reach the places that needed them before the beetles did. Martha looked toward the dark field beyond the window. She did not need more ducks. Not yet. She needed the ducks she had to stop wasting time. Before sunrise, Martha carried every loose board, fence stake, and length of wire she could find to the edge of the rice. She had spent half the night staring at the map on her kitchen table. Now she intended to make the field match it. The ducks came out of their pen expecting breakfast. Instead, Martha drove 3 stakes into the mud and stretched wire between them. She built a narrow opening toward the eastern rows, then another farther south. By 7 o'clock, sweat had soaked through the back of her dress. The baby shifted hard beneath her ribs. Martha stopped long enough to breathe. Then she moved the gate. The first attempt failed almost immediately. The ducks crowded against the wire, complained loudly, then turned around and marched back toward the shade. Martha stared at them. Fine. She opened another lane. They ignored that one too. By mid-morning, Ruth Avery appeared at the levee, with Tommy Wells carrying a bundle of fence posts over one shoulder. Martha frowned. "I didn't ask for help." "No," Ruth said. "That's why we came." Martha nearly told them to go home. Then she looked at the unfinished gates. At 20 acres of rice, at her swollen hands, she stepped aside. "Put those posts along the shallow ditch." Ruth smiled once. That was all. For the next 6 hours, they changed the field. Not the rice, not the ducks, the paths between them. Martha narrowed certain openings and widened others. She used shallow channels to draw the flock forward. She blocked the shaded corner where they wasted half the afternoon. She divided the rice into smaller sections so the ducks could work one area before drifting into the next. Nothing about it looked impressive. Old wire, crooked posts, mud. 18 noisy birds. But by afternoon, the flock was moving differently. Not because Martha had trained them, because she had finally stopped asking them to behave like machines. She watched where they naturally wanted to go, then changed the field so those instincts carried them somewhere useful. That realization hit her harder than she expected. For days she had been asking whether 18 ducks were enough. Now she understood. The ducks were never the whole answer. The system was. She opened the first gate. The flock moved through the eastern section. An hour later she closed it and opened the next. The ducks followed the shallow water south. By evening, they had covered 3 areas they normally ignored. The following morning, Martha repeated the rotation. Then again the day after that. Damage in one western patch slowed. A section near the ditch that had begun turning pale held its color. When Dr. Mercer stopped by, he crouched beside one of Martha's gates longer than usual. "You built these roots?" With Ruth and Tommy, Mercer watched the flock. "You're controlling where they can go." Martha shook her head. "Not exactly." She pointed toward the shallow lane. "I'm making the easy path the useful one." Mercer looked from the ducks to Martha, then back toward the gates. Keep records. It was the closest thing to approval he had given her. That evening, Martha stood on the levee, watching the flock move through the final section. For the first time since the beetles appeared, she allowed herself to believe the field might hold. Ruth came up beside her. "You look pleased." "I am. Dangerous habit." Martha laughed, a real laugh, the first in weeks. Across the water, the rice moved green beneath the evening wind. For one night, it looked as though Martha Hale had found the answer. Then the wind died. The air turned heavy and hot. By midnight, Beetles were striking the kitchen windows hard enough to wake her. At dawn, Martha opened the door. The fence posts were black with them, and beyond the yard, the surface of the rice seemed to move. By noon, the beetles had crossed the road. They moved in waves through Cypress County, clinging to rice leaves, fence wire, wagon wheels, even the sleeves of men working the levees. The sound was worse than the sight, a dry, restless clicking that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Silas Boone had 6 men in his fields before breakfast. By afternoon, he had 12. They hauled drums, pumped water, sprayed until their shirts were soaked through, and still the brown patches kept widening. From Martha's levee, the whole valley looked sick. Green interrupted by rust. Rust interrupted by black water. Then more rust. Her own field was holding, barely. The ducks moved constantly now. Martha rotated them from section to section, opening one gate, closing another, checking leaves, checking water, checking the notebook tucked beneath her arm. She had stopped thinking in acres. She thought in hours. How long since the east section had been worked? How many beetles in the south corner? Which lane were the ducks avoiding? What could fail before sundown? By late afternoon, Ruth found her standing knee-deep in water, one hand gripping a fence post, while the other pressed against her belly. "You're done." "I'm not." "Martha, I said I'm not." Ruth started toward her. Then a boy came running down the road. Tommy Wells. He was barefoot and crying. "My pa says come quick." Martha climbed out of the field. "What happened?" "Our lower field." That was enough. The Wells farm sat 3 miles south and held less land than Martha's. When she arrived, Tommy's father stood at the edge of the rice with his hat in both hands. The beetles had reached them overnight. One whole corner looked scraped raw. Mr. Wells stared at Martha's ducks through the wagon slats. "Could I borrow 4?" Martha said nothing. His wife stood behind him, holding a baby against her shoulder. "We'll bring them back," Wells said, "soon as this passes." Martha looked at the field, then at the birds, then back toward the road home. 4 ducks were nearly a quarter of her flock. Her southern section was already the weakest part of her system. If she removed 4 now, she would create a hole. But if she refused, she knew what might happen here. Martha opened the wagon. 4 won't save this." Wells's face fell. Then Martha pulled out a bundle of stakes. "But I'll show you what might help." For the next 3 hours they worked. Martha showed them how to divide the shallowest section first, how to keep the birds moving, how not to let them waste half the day around the shed, how to watch where they refused to forage instead of only watching where they did. She left 4 ducks with them. Not as a miracle, as a test. By the time she started home, the sky had gone violet. Ruth rode beside her in silence. Halfway back, she said, "You know what you just did?" "Yes." "You weakened your own field." "Yes." "Why?" Martha thought of Mrs. Wells holding her baby. Then of Silas telling her she was betting a child's home on barnyard birds. "If I know something that might help them," Martha said, "and I stand here watching them lose everything anyway, what exactly am I saving this place for?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. When Martha reached home, the 14 ducks she still had were already behind schedule. The southern gate should have been open before sunset. It wasn't. She worked by lantern light, pushing the flock through the rotation as fast as she dared. But darkness changed their behavior. They slowed, bunched together, ignored the far end of the section. Martha finally shut the gate near midnight. Her back ached so badly she could barely straighten. She went inside without eating. Before dawn, she woke to silence. No beetles striking the windows, no ducks calling, nothing. For one hopeful second, Martha thought the worst had passed. Then she stepped outside. The eastern rows still stood green. The center held. But along the southern quarter, a new color had appeared. Brown. Not a line this time. A patch, wide enough to see from the porch. Martha walked toward it without her boots. Mud closed around her ankles. The closer she came, the worse it looked. Chewed leaves, damaged heads, beetles tucked beneath nearly every surviving blade. She stopped at the first broken gate. For weeks, Martha had been learning what everyone else had missed. Now the field was about to show her what she had missed too. By 7 that morning, Martha had counted 63 damaged plants in the southern quarter. By 8, she stopped counting. Numbers were only useful when they told you what to do next. These numbers did not. The ducks had entered the section. The gates had been open. The water depth had looked right. And still the beetles had found a place to build. Martha stood in the mud with her notebook open in one hand. On the page, the south field looked orderly. In front of her, it looked like failure. A beetle crawled across the paper. She crushed it with her thumb, then immediately regretted it. Not because of the insect, because anger had never taught her anything. She walked the boundary again, slowly this time. At the first gate, nothing. At the second, more damage. Near the southern corner, the water deepened by several inches where the ground dipped. The ducks had crossed there before. She had watched them, or thought she had. Martha crouched. Tracks crowded the mud near the gate. Farther inside, there were almost none. She stared. The ducks had entered the section. They simply had not worked all of it. They followed the easy edge, fed there, then turned back. For weeks, Martha had been telling herself, if I can make them enter a section, they will cover it. She had never proved that. She had assumed it. The realization hurt more than Silas Boone's laughter. She sat back on her heels. For one ugly moment, she heard every voice again. Your husband bought seed. You bought mouths. You're betting a child's home on barnyard birds. Maybe they had not laughed because they were cruel. Maybe they had seen something she refused to see. Martha closed the notebook, then opened it again. Across the top of the page she wrote, South Field, my error. A truck stopped on the levee. Dr. Mercer climbed down. He took one look at the brown patch and removed his hat. Martha did not give him time to speak. I was wrong. Mercer looked at her. The birds entered the section, she continued, but they didn't cover it. I counted presence as coverage. He glanced toward the deeper water. Show me. They walked the field together. Not farmer and official, not believer and skeptic. Two people trying to read the same problem. Mercer studied the water line. Martha showed him the tracks. He checked damaged plants, then healthier ones. The deeper pocket changes their movement, he said. And the fallen stalks near the corner, they avoid those too, Martha nodded. I built gates based on where I wanted them to go. Mercer looked at her notebook. Instead of where they would actually go, the words stung, because they were true. Martha drew a new map right there on the levee. Smaller sections. Shorter rotations, a second shallow lane through the southern quarter. No section counted as worked until she had seen the flock reach the far marker. Mercer watched her redraw the routes. You'll have to change nearly everything. I know. You may lose ground in the sections that are holding. I know. And if the beetles are already established here, I know. Mercer stopped. Martha looked up. He was no longer warning her away from the idea. He was warning her about the cost of trying it properly. That was different. Ruth arrived just before noon with Tommy Wells. Tommy was grinning. The ducks ate all morning at our place. Martha looked at him. Your field? Still bad, but Pa says the little section isn't getting worse. Small proof. Nothing more. But enough. Martha handed Tommy a shovel. Then help me dig. They worked through the afternoon. A new channel through the southern quarter. Fresh stakes. Narrower gates. Ruth carried wire. Tommy dragged boards. Mercer stayed longer than anyone expected. By sunset, the field looked less like farmland and more like something assembled from desperation. Martha stood at the first gate. 14 ducks crowded behind her. The other 4 were still with the Wells family. She had fewer birds, more beetles. Less time, and a system she had just admitted was flawed. Ruth touched her arm. You don't have to do all of it tonight. Martha looked toward the brown patch. Yes, she said. I do. Then she opened the gate. The ducks moved east first. Martha waited. At the far marker, she counted them. 14. Only then did she close the section and open the next. For the first time, She did not trust the plan because she had made it. She trusted only what the field proved. By dark, the flock reached the rebuilt southern lane. Halfway through, several ducks turned toward easier water. Martha moved the barrier. They corrected. At the final marker, she counted again. All 14. The hardest decision came next. The eastern rows were still healthy. Leaving the ducks there would protect what she already had. Sending them south meant leaving those healthy rows exposed. But the damaged section could not wait. Martha opened the last gate. The flock turned toward the brown patch. Behind her, healthy rice went unprotected. She watched the ducks disappear between the rows. No applause, no certainty, just a choice. By morning, Martha would know whether she had corrected her mistake or spread it across the entire farm. Martha was in the field before sunrise. She had slept less than 2 hours. The lantern still burned on the porch behind her as she crossed the levee, one hand beneath her belly, the other gripping the notebook she had stopped trusting without evidence. Mist lay low over the rice. For several minutes, she could not tell what had happened. Everything was gray. Then the sun began to rise. Color returned slowly. First the black water, then the pale fence posts, then the southern quarter. Martha stopped walking. There was damage, more than she wanted to see. Several patches had gone brown. Leaves hung torn from the stems. Along one corner, the beetles had stripped enough plants that muddy water showed through where green should have been. Her stomach dropped. Then she looked farther in. The rice was standing. Not all of it. Enough. Martha stepped into the water. The 14 ducks were already working the new lane. They reached the far marker, turned along the barrier she and Mercer had built, and moved into the next section. This time they were not bunching at the easy edge. They were covering the field. Martha checked the first plants. Beetles remained. But fewer than yesterday. She checked another row, then another. The southern quarter had not been saved untouched. It had been held. That difference meant everything. By 8 o'clock, Dr. Mercer arrived. He said nothing when he saw Martha. He simply removed his boots, rolled his trousers, and stepped into the field. For nearly an hour, he inspected plants, healthy rows, damaged rows, deep water, shallow lanes, the rebuilt gates. He counted beetles in places Martha had marked the day before and compared them with the numbers in her notebook. By then, people had begun gathering along the road. Nobody had invited them. They came anyway. Tommy Wells arrived first with his father. Behind their wagon, inside a rough slatted crate, were the 4 ducks Martha had loaned them. Tommy jumped down before the wagon fully stopped. "Pa says we can manage the little section now." Mr. Wells lifted the crate down. "And these belong back where they started." Martha looked toward his lower field in the distance. "How is it?" "Still hurt," Wells said. "But that patch you showed us hasn't gotten worse. Not a victory. Not yet. But proof enough to matter." Martha opened the crate. The 4 ducks tumbled out noisily, hurried toward the others, and within minutes, all 18 were moving together through the rice again. Then 2 farmers from the northern road arrived. Then men Martha recognized from the Saturday market. Finally, Silas Boone's truck stopped beside the ditch. He climbed out alone. No one laughed. Across the county, the damage was becoming impossible to hide. Fields that had been green a week earlier now carried long brown scars. Silas's largest tract looked worst of all. From Martha's levee, the contrast could be seen without explanation. Brown on one side of the drainage ditch, green on the other. Not perfect green. Martha was glad for that. Perfect would have looked like luck. Her field had wounds, but it was alive. Mercer finally climbed out of the water. Everyone waited for him. He wiped mud from his hands with a handkerchief. "Well?" someone asked. Mercer looked toward Martha instead of the crowd. "You were right about one thing." Martha almost smiled. "Only one?" A few men shifted awkwardly. Mercer pointed toward the southern quarter. "The ducks are reducing insect pressure where they're actually working." Silas folded his arms. "So the birds saved it." Mercer shook his head. "No." That surprised everyone. He pointed toward the gates. "The birds didn't put themselves there. then toward the shallow channels. They didn't change the water, then toward Martha's notebook, and they didn't notice where the first system failed. Mercer looked back across the field. She didn't keep beetles out. She kept the pressure from building long enough in any one section to strip it bare. Silence followed. Martha felt something brush against her skirt. A white feather floated on the water beside her boot. She bent and picked it up. For an instant she remembered the market. Silas laughing. Your husband bought seed, you bought mouths. Now one of the men who had laughed that morning stepped closer to the fence. Mrs. Hale? Martha looked up. What did you change first? The question struck her harder than any apology could have. He had not asked Mercer. He had asked her. Martha opened her notebook. Before she could answer, Silas crossed the drainage ditch. He stopped beside the wooden gate and stared at the 18 ducks moving through the rice, then at the brown fields behind him. How many of those birds do you have left? 18. Silas nodded slowly. I'll buy them. Martha said nothing. I mean it, he continued. Name your price. The men at the fence watched her. 6 weeks earlier, Silas Boone had laughed at the idea that 18 ducks could be worth $12. Now he was standing in the mud asking Martha what they were worth. She rested one hand on the gate. You still think it's the ducks? Silas frowned. And for the first time since the outbreak began, Martha knew the hardest part was no longer proving that her field had survived. It was explaining why. Silas Boone looked at Martha as if he had misheard her. What do you mean, I still think it's the ducks? 18 birds moved through the rice beyond the gate, bills working beneath the leaves. Silas watched them. They ate the beetles. Some of them. They kept your field standing. They helped. Then sell them to me. Martha shook her head. Silas's jaw tightened. I'll pay $50. A murmur moved through the men behind him. Martha remembered the market. $12 for all 18. 80 cents left in her pocket. $50 would once have been impossible to refuse. No, 100. Martha almost laughed. Not because the offer was funny, because Silas was trying to solve the problem the same way he had solved every problem he could remember. Buy more, own more, spend enough money until uncertainty disappeared. Martha opened the gate. Come here. Silas hesitated, then stepped into the field. His polished boots sank immediately. Martha did not explain everything. She did not need to. She pointed toward the ducks. Watch them. Silas waited. The flock reached a shallow lane, turned naturally, and moved toward the southern section. One bird tried to slip toward the shaded edge. A simple barrier redirected it. Silas looked at the crooked stakes, then at the water, then at Martha. You made them do that? No. Martha shook her head. I learned what they were already going to do. She pointed toward the brown scar in the southern quarter. That's where I got it wrong. Silas looked at her. Martha did not look away. I thought getting them through a gate meant they had worked the whole section, and they hadn't. No, there was no shame in saying it now, only information. So I changed the field. Silas stared across the rice. Something in his expression shifted. He could buy 18 ducks by sunset. He could buy 100. What he could not buy was the mistake that taught Martha what the first system had missed. He could not buy the notebook in her hand, or the hours she had spent following muddy tracks through rice. One of the farmers behind them called out, Would it work on my place? Martha turned. I don't know. The man seemed disappointed. Then Martha pointed toward his property. But we can find out. That answer quieted the group. Not a miracle, not a secret recipe, something that had to be watched. Tested, adjusted. Dr. Mercer stood near the fence saying nothing. He no longer needed to speak for her. Silas looked toward his own damaged acreage. How many ducks would I need? Martha picked up one of the spare wooden stakes beside the gate. None yet. Silas frowned. She held the stake toward him. First you need to know where they go. For a moment he did not take it. 6 weeks earlier, this same man had stood above Martha at the market and explained what a real farmer would have bought. Now Martha stood in her own field, waiting for him to decide whether he was willing to learn. Silas reached out, took the stake. Martha pointed across the drainage ditch. Start small. Silas Boone stepped into the mud. The other farmers followed. Behind them, all 18 ducks moved quietly through the rice. This time, no one laughed. By harvest, the valley had changed color again. Not brown this time, gold. The surviving rice bent beneath the weight of grain, and along the hale field, the old wire gates still stood where Martha had left them. Some were crooked. One leaned badly toward the ditch. None of them looked important. But people stopped to look anyway. Dr. Mercer came twice that month with farmers from neighboring counties. Silas Boone came more often. He never asked to buy the ducks again. Instead, he brought a notebook. 3 weeks after the outbreak broke, Martha gave birth to a daughter. Ruth Avery stayed at the house for 6 days. On the 7th morning, Martha found her on the porch holding the baby while sunlight moved across the fields. "You should be sleeping," Ruth said. So should she. The baby made a small sound and settled against Ruth's shoulder. Martha lowered herself into the chair beside them. For a while, neither woman spoke. Then Martha looked toward the rice. "I couldn't have done it alone," Ruth turned to her. Months earlier, those words would have felt like surrender. Now they did not. Ruth smiled. "No one does." Later that afternoon, Martha opened the notebook she had carried through the outbreak. Most of it was ugly. Mud stains, bent pages, wrong numbers crossed out, maps drawn twice, then 3 times. She kept all of it, especially the mistakes. On a clean page near the back, she began writing what she wished she had known in the beginning, where the ducks preferred shallow water, where they wasted time, which gates had failed, why the southern quarter had nearly cost her the crop, and why watching mattered more than assuming. A white feather slipped from between 2 pages. Martha picked it up. The first one, the feather that had clung to her sleeve, the morning Silas laughed at the market. She pressed it carefully onto the page. Then she wrote the date beneath it, the day her daughter was born. Outside, the ducks moved between the stubble left after harvest. 18 mouths, Silas had called them. Maybe he had not been entirely wrong. They had been mouths, hungry ones. But hunger, Martha had learned, could become useful when someone paid attention to where it moved. She closed the notebook. Her daughter would inherit the house, the field, perhaps even the ducks. But Martha hoped she would inherit something better. Not a secret, not a miracle, a habit. Watch closely. Admit when you are wrong. Change what needs changing. And never mistake needing help for being helpless. Across the road, Silas Boone drove a new stake into the edge of his own field. This time, he measured twice before setting it. Martha watched him for a moment. Then she smiled. 6 weeks earlier, the men at the market had laughed because a pregnant woman spent nearly her last dollar on 18 ducks. By harvest, those same men were standing ankle-deep in mud, asking her where to put the first gate. The ducks had helped save a crop, but what Martha Hale truly saved was the right to decide what her child's home could become.